we're particularly pleased to have somebody with us who not only has written about Arab feminism, but herself has practiced it, on the ground.
I think the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. As you are discovering yourself and discovering how you feel about things and what things you will accept and love and what things you will reject and fight against and where you're constrained and how you're going to react to those constraints. I think those are the things that push you to become creative.
Welcome, Dr. Alanoud Al Sharekh. We are so pleased to have you here at New York University, Abu Dhabi, in Zoom life for Women in Work in the Gulf. I'm really so delighted that you're joining our class because we have just sort of discussed a bunch of chapters from this book on Arab feminisms and really kind of looking at the variety of ways in which we can think about what it means to be a feminist or to practice feminism in this region. We had one chapter by Saad Jaremi from the UAE who also talked about how do we think about Gulf feminism in relation to kind of existing Arab paradigms. And so we're particularly pleased to have somebody with us who not only has written about Arab feminism, but herself has practiced it, on the ground. And so I think what I'd like to do is maybe just share really briefly that Dr. Alanoud is a researcher, an academic, and an activist. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this notion of al-ghadab al-na'im and how that appears in your work and what that project was about.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. May, for having me in your class, and the thanks is extended to your students as well for engaging with me today. I have to say that the question of feminism appeared before the PhD and informed my decision for the PhD. And it's why, for me, activism and academics have been intertwined so closely. I finished my master's on a scholarship from Kuwait University in applied linguistics and came back to Kuwait pregnant with a girl. And I ended up joining a group of women activists who were at the National Assembly because there was a bill that was supposed to give women their political rights in Kuwait. And of course, I was very excited because up to that point, I didn't have a voice politically. And I didn't want my daughter to have to go through the same thing. And we lost that bill. And the reaction in the room when we lost that bill between the men who were fighting for us and were dismayed and the men who are clapping and so happy that we lost our basic rights. I mean, I think it created kind of a cognitive dissonance for me. The refrains that we are hearing about women being idolized in our culture and the paradise being under the feet of mothers and the same people who believe that want to deny their mothers a right to choose their representative or run for office. So I was enraged and curious about this. So I changed my PhD thesis proposal to look more at the question of feminism, and because I was somebody who was interested in literature and linguistics, I wanted to look at comparative feminism within that frame. So my PhD looked at the intersection between the rising feminist consciousness and feminist movements, like how they manifested in women's fiction.
What other kinds of, sort of like emotions are tied to engaging with writing about feminism in our part of the world with a Western audience? So kind of the experiences or the, process of getting something published, in a recognized, let's say, journal or in a recognized, publication, which requires essentially translating your ideas, your understandings of things to an audience maybe who isn't necessarily on the same page. I'd love to hear a bit about that because I had read this really amazing piece of writing that you had for Love or Nation, right? On the citizenship rights of children of Kuwaiti mothers who married non-Kuwaitis. And thinking through that question of what does it mean to think about those rights in relation to other claims of citizenship rights by other groups that coexist in the country. So non-citizens in general, Ibtidoon, various groups, and how those debates about mothers' rights, or I guess women's rights in relation to their children, are intricately connected to those other debates that are happening at the same time. But somehow they are siloed. They are not discussed kind of in the same context. So I would love if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I wrote a piece also that was published by Q Science a few years ago that looks at the act of translation within writing about feminism or feminism in academics. And I think that it's a political act as well. Like you can't escape. If you're dealing with feminism and you're documenting it and you're translating it and you're looking at it from one cultural lens to explain it in another cultural lens, it's already an act of social instigation, because you have to, for example, when we use terminology that is taken from Western academia, patriarchy, for example, when you try to translate that into Arabic, then you have to designate who the patriarch is, right? Is it al-Abawiyya? Is it al-Dhukuriyya, right? So then you're designating kind of the oppressor. And so purely by engaging in feminist discourse and trying to translate it and trying to explain it, you've become a political agent, and you've put yourself in a position where you have to name particular entities and designate a role to them. And I'm in the process of writing another piece about translating honor killings in a cultural vacuum, also where this question of terminology becomes really important. But the paper that you asked me about, Love or Country, A Difficult Choice for Kuwaiti Women Married to Non-Nationals, that was a really interesting experience, because not only was I looking at it as an academic and as a researcher, but I was also looking at it from the lived experience of being a Kuwaiti woman married to a non-national, and how that informed the way that I would see the issue, which I think is decidedly different from how somebody from a Eurocentric perspective would see it, because they would perhaps not feel that the nuances between the different groups that you talked about, the stateless groups, Bedouins, the general expats in the community that also have a right to ask for citizenship after a certain number of years in the country and after certain generations, etc. So they wouldn't necessarily care about the nuances between these different groups. But for me, because of my lived experience and because I am from this region and I know that they are treated differently for policymakers and within the, let's say, socio-political fabric, those differences are very, very much real and very much important. And I feel that sometimes as feminists and as academics writing from one region to another, we sometimes face a kind of pushback in terms of needing to find European sources or European voices to validate what it is that you're seeing and that you're going through. And now people are aware of that more than before. There's a whole movement to decolonize academia and to give lived experiences and voices from the region let's say the academic weight that they deserve.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And honestly, these are the kinds of things that, we've been really sort of grappling with as we think about, what does it mean, to have a voice on something? What does it mean to contend with the structural inequalities that underpin, the geopolitics of knowledge production about a region or about a people, right? And, some of the things that we've done is also look at the connections between like internal critiques. So, reading somebody like Patricia Hill Collins in the US who wrote about, Black feminist thought and her pushback against like very kind of like dominant ways of producing knowledge. And then, these kind of more, doesn't seem like there was necessarily any conversation happening there, but it seems like there are lots of similarities and approaches. And Arab feminists who are also pushing back against particular kinds of, an intellectual heritage that you have to carry in order to say something. Or, in this beautiful example that you shared with us, the politics of referencing. So if you exclude something that is considered absolutely vital to include simply because it's in a particular kind of academy that has a particular kind of privilege, does that mean that you are necessarily changing what you have to say, or necessarily including something not on terms that are like relevant to you and your academic and political practice? Like, I think these are the kinds of conundrums, let's say, or issues that kind of come up for a lot of people who are writing about these kinds of things in our region. And so I would love to hear a little bit more from you, not just about the academic writing and the kind of political place that in a way propelled you to get into the academic writing, but also bringing us back to that space of activism that you just started us off with. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about Abolish 153 and the work that you're doing with them. And then maybe we can transition to hearing a little bit more about the recent win for Kuwaiti women to decriminalize domestic violence.
I mean, it's all tied into being a political researcher of sorts, as well as being an activist. So when I got really active in the movement demanding equal political rights for women in Kuwait after the incident that I told you guys about, and I mean, it really informed my PhD. And then when I came back, I became much more active in the protest movements. In Kuwait, we had always had women asking for greater participation. This is the last of the big protests in Kuwait, and this was a protest that was organized independently by young women. This is me at the protest at the time, and it was organized by independent groups working with young women. And a few months later, we did get our political rights, and a lot of that has to do also with male allies that we had lobbying for us, and also Kuwait being an imperfect democracy up until that stage, because it was a democracy made for men only. I was teaching while being part of this movement, but then when we got our political rights in the 16th of May 2005, I really wanted to just be free of my obligations teaching and to really focus on this amazing moment and what it meant, and how women were going to engage in electoral politics. And so I finished my contract teaching at the Arab Open University and devoted myself to research projects full time. And I was lucky enough to get grants and to get asked by international organizations to work on different projects. But one of the grants that I got was to look at all the laws in Kuwait that discriminate against women, because my idea was that Kuwaiti women have been outside of the field where they run for office or they vote or engage politically, so they're not aware that there are so many laws that discriminate against them. And so to get them interested in voting and to get them, you know, excited to be part of the process, you have to rile them up a little bit. You have to get them just a little bit angry. And so I worked with the law office to look at all the legislations in Kuwait that discriminated against women at that time. The one that got most attention was the passport law, which said that a woman couldn't renew her passport without her husband's consent. And that's in clear violation of our constitution. And when women entered the National Assembly in 2009, they changed that with a simultaneous case that was going through a constitutional court. So that's no longer a law in Kuwait. But I was shocked to find that we had what was called an honor killing legislation. Article 153 of our penal code treats honor killings. So if a man surprises a member of his female kin, his wife, his mother, his sister, his daughter, in an act of adultery, and it's not really conditioned in the same way that an act of adultery within Sharia law would be. So you don't need the 4 witnesses, for example. And kills her or kills him or kills them both, it's considered a misdemeanor. It's not a crime. And so I couldn't believe it. Like, Kuwait is supposedly one of the most liberal and progressive countries in the Arabian Gulf, and yet this heinous piece of legislation exists. And I realized that there were other legislations that were problematic to do with guardianship and to do with what I call disciplinary violence, the idea that your male guardian is allowed to physically discipline you. And so I thought this deserved a broader conversation, and it was an important conversation to have, because there's a conspiracy of silence around domestic violence, and it's a problem across the world, whether it's in the name of honor, or in the name of guardianship, or in the name of love. So it took us a while after that, 8 years actually, after when I first initially found the law, to actually have a movement to abolish it. And you know, the political space was a little bit hostile to women and to opening up these conversations. There was also an issue of finding the right partners. And in 2013, there was a case where a young Kuwaiti woman was stabbed by her father, who then, she was studying abroad, who then went to the police station and said, "It's fine, there's a law in my country that allows this for honor." And so it reignited this idea in me that we have to do something about this law, because its very existence is dangerous. Let's assume that no one uses it, and that is a fallacy. It is used, but let's assume that no one uses it. Its existence is offensive and unnecessary and dangerous. So 4 brave women, much braver than me, decided to risk their reputations and careers and join me in launching this initiative. And we, you know, we were lucky enough to have help and advice from Kafa organization in Lebanon, and from Rana Al-Husseini, who is a journalist who works on this in Jordan. She wrote a book called, I think it was called Murder in the Name of Honor. But we launched officially in 2015, and you know, the medium that we used was art. And we decided to approach this softly as a cultural project rather than go into a confrontation, because you have to educate people that this law exists and that this law is not Sharia compliant, and it's not part of our constitutional or international legal agreements. And so, you know, we faced some resistance in the beginning, but eventually, 2 years later, in May 2017, we got 5 MPs to sign a bill to abolish Article 153, but it still hasn't been discussed in the National Assembly, because they, and by they I mean the 49 men and 1 woman who represent us, have to decide that it's a priority. But what happened was, as we were talking about disciplinary violence and ending legislations and social practices to do with honor killings and honor crimes, a lot of survivors of abuse were approaching us for help. So we did a sister NGO that's registered called IFAR to deal with survivors of abuse. And then we started to lobby really hard within Parliament to pass a domestic violence law so that we can open a shelter, or the government can open a shelter, because the government announced the shelter in 2017 that to this day is not functional because there was no law. And alhamdulillah, we were very lucky and persistent, and the law passed in 4 years. So from 2016 to the 19th of August 2020, when the domestic violence law finally passed. And there's a provision in it that says that they have to review all the laws in Kuwait that could possibly incite violence.
That's so fantastic, really, Alanoud, and so interesting. Actually, the multiple layers of thinking through, not only kind of what is a social problem that deserves addressing, who the stakeholders are that are likely to care or not care about this or even fight it, but also what are the ways in which one does this in a specific context. So even just hearing the language that you were using around framing something as it's on the one hand not Sharia compliant, on the other hand it doesn't, it is in contradiction of these international treaties, on the other hand, even if it's not being actively spoken about, it exists, right? So the kind of almost the complexity of that entire thing, and the ability to kind of strategically frame it with this, what you were describing as kind of artistic, but really is a kind of, I guess, mechanism for translating this notion of consciousness, right? Into a space that allows people to see it for what it is, rather than just simply reject it because it's being called a certain type of feminism, right? Or a certain kind of action. But my last question for you is, kind of thinking about, so much of the work that you've done, both kind of like academic, but also in terms of this activist space, is it seems to me like you are in movement. Your description of the things that you've done and what's motivated a lot of your work is really almost rooted in this mobility, this ability to see things through movement, Kuwait, the UK, back to Kuwait, engaging with other, organizations in a variety of places in, kind of like Europe, but then back to Kuwait with this new angle, and, even kind of mobility through experiences of motherhood. Like what happens when you're bringing a child to the world and you look at the world and you're like, that's not the world I want my child to be a part of. Something has to change, And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, kind of like reflecting back on some of the work that you've done, are there ways in which you have felt in the past that you were constrained, or where your creativity was being smooshed in a way, or, and how did you kind of navigate around that? But equally, what was expansive for you? Like what were moments where you really felt like you had a flow,
It's a very deep question, May, but I'll try to address it this way. So I think the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. And as you are discovering yourself and discovering how you feel about things, and what things you will accept and love, and what things you will reject and fight against, and where you are constrained, and how you're going to react to those constraints. I think those are the things that push you to become creative. So my academic work bled into my activism, and the idea that we needed to get people angry, but also my activism, like starting with this idea of let's tackle the most violent legislation and work our way down. And it brought the suffering of abuse survivors to me, which I wasn't particularly aware of as being so prevalent and so ignored. And then lobbying brought the fact to me that we really had a problem with representation. There's a lack of women in leadership positions. What are we going to do about this? And I was lucky enough to be able to set up a political consultancy called Ibtikar and pivot so that I can focus on enabling women and young people to run for office, to set up their own NGOs, to manage campaigns, etc., so that we can have our own in-house programs for political leaders who are women from this region and who are able to engage in this region using expertise from the West and local expertise. And this experience, in turn, the Empowering Kuwaiti Women in Politics program, which Ibtikar did in 2018, got inspired by what we saw a platform supporting women running for office. And a few weeks ago, we launched Mudawi's List in Kuwait. And Mudawi's List is a platform that helps women candidates running for public office as long as it's elected. So if they're running for co-ops, municipality, for the parliament, for, I don't know, maybe student unions in future. But the idea is that as you immerse yourself in one field, you figure out needs and you realize that things are missing and that you get excited about contributing to or being involved in. And as you see yourself in others' eyes, you realize that you have to navigate yourself differently. So, you know, as being a feminist, I think we are tolerated everywhere, not necessarily celebrated anywhere, right? But and back home, there's this question of, well, if you are asking for more rights, then you are, you know, importing a Western agenda, right? Somehow you've been brainwashed by your education and your exposure, so you can't speak for the women of Kuwait. I'm really happy you asked this question because me and May were talking about this before, and this is something that I write about and I talk about a lot, which is this burden of ambassadorship, right? That as an Arab or as a Muslim woman, particularly, I have to represent all Arab or all Muslim women or all Kuwaiti women or all feminists for that matter. And now, you know, especially in the intersectional feminist age, I'm pretty sure I do not represent all feminists or all Kuwaiti feminists for that matter. But I think that social media has liberated a lot of women in this part of the world, in that they have a platform ready, not just women, I would say a lot of disenfranchised groups, because before there was very tight control of the media, and an op-ed was so difficult. You had to be so established, and the editors had to know you, and you had to come from a certain background, and you know, knowledge production is May's thing, but you get what I mean, right? And suddenly it democratized having a voice. You know, my 12-year-old could have access to a platform and speak. Anybody, no matter what their background or their education, for good or for bad. You know, I mean, the product of that is a lot of trolling and disgusting bullying online. But at the same time, it helps to push back against this burden of representation. I am not required to represent anyone except myself. I don't represent the Sharikhs, you know, which is another level of representation that we have to deal with as well, that you carry this family name as a burden. And I was just in a panel, and one of the young feminists just goes by her first name, like Madonna or Cher, because she doesn't want to deal with the tribal burden of her last name. And I thought that was really, really interesting. But, you know, it's up to us to be aware of these burdens of representation, and to choose what we accept and what we don't. I see myself as being a Kuwaiti woman, a Khaleeji woman, an Arab, and a Muslim, but I see myself as being a lot more than that, and the way that I define those things could be manifestly different than anybody else defines them. And so I find this this idea that we have to fulfill a particular stereotype or people will get uncomfortable. I find it really funny in this day and age. But when I was a visiting scholar from the Islamic world, which is one of the Fulbright programs, and I think I was the first woman they had in this program as a visiting scholar from the Islamic world. All the other scholars were men. I was sent to Whittier College in California, and they really made me sing for my supper. So I went to Rotary clubs, golf clubs, libraries. I mean, you name it, I was there. But I was also going through all the different classes, and then the students would evaluate. And one of the evaluations I found very telling. He said, "She doesn't look Muslim, she doesn't sound Muslim, I don't know what she's selling, but I'm not buying it." There was an image in his mind of what Muslims should look and sound like, and I wasn't fulfilling it. So the burden of representation comes from home, it comes from the West, it comes from being told that beauty is essential for women, and we have to maintain it, you know, with the fillers, real or on Instagram filters. I don't know, and this is a whole other thing that feminists have to look at today: selfies and self-esteem with young women. But yeah, I embrace or reject these labels as and when I feel they speak to me. I'm allowed to contain multitudes, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this question of like, the category, the relationship between the self and categories, is really complex, and whether one has to fulfill the category perfectly in order to occupy it, or whether one can fulfill the category on one's own terms. What does that look like? What does it feel like? And it's often not one category, just kind of, as we've heard you describe, it's multiple categories that come together and then intersect in complex ways, and then you move to a new context and all of a sudden they change, right? So it's this constant kind of way of having to think about who one is in relation to, but then also to do that thing that you talked about, I guess, of not to readily accept being defined by the terms of other people.
Wow, those are good questions. Well, let's start with the first one. So the first one is that you're absolutely right. So the child protection law took about 10 years to pass in Kuwait. That's why I say we feel very proud and happy that it only took 4 years to pass the domestic violence law, because of this idea of a private-public divide. And the domestic space is sacred, and it's very much wherever you are in the world, people don't want you telling them how to raise their children or how to conduct themselves within their relationships, how to express love, etc. But at the end of the day, you have to decide that protecting the weakest among us is more important than than having the sacred domestic space being exposed. And this was really a conversation that I was dismayed to have with an authority figure back in 2007, when I was really excited to engage with this idea of domestic violence. And they were saying that, we can't break up a family. And I was thinking, well, if it's a family where incest and abuse is happening, what are we saving it for, right? This is not a good family. But the idea of the family as being sacred is very entrenched. And this is something that not only abuse survivors have to deal with, the idea of shame, which I think applies all over the world, and not just in this part of the world, but the idea of shame and admitting that this has happened to you and happened to you from a loved one, and that you were, the self-esteem questions that come with it. Are you weak? Are you bringing it to yourself? Is it something that you deserve? All of that heavy burden. But also, I think in this part of the world, because we're still communal and not so individual, we self-censor anyway. So if I'm writing an article, I'm self-censoring almost subconsciously. I self-censor what I'm saying. I'm always aware that the stakes are higher, because even if I don't think of myself as representing the sharikhs, others will. So I have to be aware of that. And I think that really comes into play for survivors of abuse who are pushed and cajoled and convinced that the more loving choice is not to report it, not to bring shame to the family and to them, and that others will intervene, etc. That's why there's a provision in this newly passed domestic violence law that says that the person who tries to convince the abuser to step down or not to report it, etc., they will be punished as well. And I think that's a really important provision, because and the sad thing that it comes from a good place. People think that if they tell you it's okay, it's your husband or your dad or your brother or your mother, and she loves you, she did this out of love, that they're being good people. But at the end of the day, they're asking the abusers to accept an untenable situation, right? Why should they have to accept it? Why does the burden of keeping the family intact be on them? And then you're stopping the rehabilitation process for both the abused and the abuser. As for your second question, I think that could take up a whole class, but I'll give you the 2-sentence answer. These programs are essential. They're well-funded and they're well-meaning, but sometimes the difficulty comes from having a preconceived notion. So when these proposals are being cooked in offices far, far away from the locale where they're going to be implemented, there's no voice for local expertise or local needs. So then the budget is set and the framework is made, and then it comes to be implemented, and the implementation process falls apart because it doesn't work in a local context, or it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And this also comes into the idea of who's funding this project. So if the donor country is funding a project that's going to take place in country, there's a limit to how much you can criticize or how much you can shine a light on the actual problems. Well, I will say start with the research. So be very well-versed in the law itself, its history. For example, 153 is a colonial law. It comes from Napoleonic Code, and our legislators got creative with it. But that's its history. And you have to be aware of, if you're in a Muslim country, you have to be aware of the perspective of Islam on it, Sharia, what are the arguments for both sides, and who the stakeholders are. You have to do a complete SWOT analysis, but also you have to be very aware of what are the risks that you are taking, not just to you, but to your family, to your loved ones, and to the people that you're inviting to be part of this cause. And you have to be very upfront about what those risks are. You know, we had dinner with about 100 people, and out of those 100 people, 3 people stepped up to join me and the original co-founder in Abolish 153. So, and you have to be very patient, because change takes time, and you have to be aware that, you know, being controversial could get you a lot of media attention, but it probably won't get you the collaborators that you need. So if you want to enact change in country, you have to be very inclusive of even those who oppose you, because they have to be also part of the collaborative process of change. You have to be willing to work with government, who usually are very slow, and you have to be willing to make your concept sticky enough so that young people can take it and run with it. And it's not like a centralized NGO where, you know, the president has to take a vote with the board every time somebody needs to do something. So these are, you know, I think that the best tips that I can give you. And also just if you feel strongly enough about it, do it. It's not going to be easy, but just go for it. What's the worst that can happen? Do it in steps. Do a litmus test. Like use the internet, write a little article and see what the reaction is. And you just take it from there, step by step.
So thank you so much, Alanoud, for you know, such a rich discussion of not only kind of a variety of topics, but also locations and also moments in history and forms of engagement that you've taken us through together. And I think there are a whole range of ways in which kind of your story about the various things that you've done really kind of shed like a new light on some of the things that we've been reading about how academics have talked about, you know, Arab feminism, how to understand it, how to think beyond the kind of confines of categories and words. And so I'm really deeply appreciative. You know, there are a couple of things that really stood out to me, you know, questions of this burden of ambassadorship, which I think people can relate to, you know, in so many different locations, in so many different contexts. You know, this question of patience, you know, which sounds really good on paper, but in reality requires a lot, right? Like a lot of oneself. And then this last point that you made about kind of the interconnectedness of things, you know, the people who are for the thing, the people who are against the thing, people who say they're going to help you, but then they don't show up, and then the people who are a core part of what you're doing. And so I think it really helps us think beyond the kind of binaries that are often presented in a simple way, men versus women, you know, or secular versus Islamic, or, you know, that are actually really not helpful at all. So this was really so wonderful. And again, you know, I can't tell you how much I deeply appreciate you taking the time to speak to us with such candor and such generosity. And, you know, we hope that, you know, in a couple of years, if I host you again for Women in Work in the Gulf, you will share with us that not only has that law been reversed, and so your daughter's future and your son's future is a better future, but there have been many other things that have happened along the way that open up kind of new horizons for everybody who's there. So thank you so much, Alanoud, really.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all your students for engaging with this topic. Shukran.